welcome to the Birch Aquarium at Scripps Oceanography. I am Nigella Hilgarth. I'm the Executive Director of the Birch Aquarium, and this evening is the latest in the Jeffrey B. Graham Perspectives on Ocean Science lectures, and it gives me great pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Dr. Russ Chapman. Most of you know that Russ is now the Executive Director of CMBC here at Scripps Oceanography, but I want to tell you a little bit about his distinguished career as a botanist, among other things. He went to Dartmouth College, got his BA in 1968, and then he went to UC Davis, got his master's in 1970 in botany, and also in 1973 he finished his PhD in, not surprisingly, phycology, given tonight's talk. And his research interests are in algal ultrastructure and phylogeny. He's had a very distinguished career, mainly at Louisiana State University. He first of all went there as an assistant professor in 1973. And in fact, he went through the ranks and was left there in 2005 as a full professor. But during that time as a professor of botany, he also began to do a lot of administrative jobs, and he's one of those rare individuals that is a distinguished scientist and also a very good administrator. He was Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences from 1979 to 83, and Associate Dean of the College of Basic Sciences in 1983 to 84, and he was Chair of the Department of Plant Biology from 1988 to 1994, and the Associate Vice Chancellor of the Office of Research and Economic Development from 94 to 96. And then after a stint as Interim Director, he became the Executive Director for the Center for Coastal Energy and Environmental Resources at Louisiana State University. And after that, in 2001, he became the Dean of the said School of the Coast and Environment. So we were very, very lucky to entice him here to come and be the Executive Director of the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation at Scripps Oceanography. Before I ask him to start the lecture tonight, I want to tell you just a few personal snippets about Russ that will give you an idea of the diversity of his interests and background. He loves to boogie board, I gather. He also has a deep interest in music and theater, and in fact has even written his own one-act play that I believe has been staged. And also he did a two-act opera, which is pretty exciting, and I'm expecting him to burst into song sometime this evening. Just to give you an idea of his intense interest in algae, I heard this evening from his wife, Melanie, that when he was in the ICU, he was actually found lecturing the nurses on algae. So that gives you an example of somebody who's had clearly a lifelong and passionate interest in algae. So now over to Russ to talk about the world's most important plants, algae.
Thank you, Nigella, and I hope all of you can hear. Many of you know that good speakers tend to begin by saying how happy they are to be with you for this presentation. And I would like to begin this evening by telling you how happy I am to be here with you. I would like to do that, but I can't. And the problem is with Nigella. And Nigella, some of you may not realize this, but some time ago I sent Nigella 2 or 3 pages of do's and don'ts for good presentations. And I am standing here petrified because I'm afraid that Nigella will have those sheets of do's and don'ts and is going to be checking them off as I speak. So Nigella, please tell me you don't have those lists with you.
But now you've reminded me, I'm just...
I am now doomed. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be with you this evening to talk about the algae. And if I can do this correctly, the algae, the world's most important plants. And the subtitle for this evening's presentation is that your life depends on them. And I'm going to try and do in 40 or 45 minutes what I normally do over a 12-week period in teaching phycology. So please hold on to your seats here as we try and go through this. The plan. If all goes well, I'm going to start very quickly talking about attitudes, including perhaps your attitude. Then I'm going to go on to the big point of why the algae are the world's most important plants. Do you all see that plants is in quotation marks? Yes or no? Yes. Is that important? Yes. Right. Going on, I'll introduce what the algae are and then talk about some of the big ones, the seaweeds that many of you know, and then comment, to be fair, about some of the small ones that are also extremely important. Then try and throw at you some more reasons the algae are more important than you may have thought. And then, God willing, at the end we'll come to the last slide. And we'll all be delighted we've gotten to that point. Now, the algae and attitude. The English language is partly at fault here. As most of you know, we often refer to the algae as the sea weeds. And if they're freshwater algae, we often refer to them as pond scum. We've got an attitude problem already, and some people even refer to them as frog spittle. This is bad attitude. Now, these algae students, or phycology students back at LSU, have the right attitude. The mere fact they're taking a course in phycology shows how smart they are, and they've got a good, healthy attitude. And I'm going to teach you the fundamentals very, very quickly. Are you ready? Here we go. Good attitude, phycology, phycos and logos, Greek and Greek. That is the correct term. That is good. Algology, Latin and Greek, a bad mixture. Technically, algology should be the study of pain or painful study. So that's not the right term, even though we have journals of algology, and I'm on one of the editorial boards of such a journal. But you know, better than those journals, phycology is the right word. Now here's the hardest part. One alga, two or more algae. Does everybody understand? Alga, the singular in Latin, algae, the plural. So let's see if we can do this. One, two or more. This is fantastic. There are famous scientists around the world who haven't gotten that straight yet, and you've got it done immediately. All right, now the big picture. Why algae are so important. What is this? What is this nickname? The blue planet. Why is it called the blue planet? Water. When you have lots of water, what do you have? Lots of algae. And if you have lots of algae, what do you have? Lots of oxygen. So, half or more of the oxygen we're breathing comes from the algae. If you don't agree with me that the algae are the world's most important plants, please hold your breath for the next 12 hours, and we will discuss this issue later. So the algae are giving you the air you breathe right now during this lecture, for better or for worse, but we can go back in time. We can go back about 3.5 billion years ago when the blue-green algae, or Cyanobacteria, arose. And these microscopic algae had pigments and started doing photosynthesis, and they produced oxygen. So here's the start of our life story, in a sense. What happened to the levels of oxygen in the atmosphere? Did they go up or not? Yes or no? Don't be frightened, the camera's not on you. Did the oxygen levels go up with all those millions of blue-green algae producing oxygen? Yes or no? Yes. No. It was a trick question, as you should have suspected. I am told by colleagues who know these things that for millions of years the oxygen that was being produced did go into the atmosphere, but it was quickly used up to oxidize iron ores and other minerals that could be oxidized. And so the oxygen did not really accumulate for a while. For a long while, actually. It wasn't until 2.2 billion years ago that the oxygen levels started to really increase, and eukaryotic life, as we know it, had a beginning because oxygen was now in the atmosphere. So think about that. Those little blue-green algae are producing oxygen, and for over 1 billion years it's not doing much. Did they give up? No. They kept photosynthesizing until they changed the atmosphere and evolution of higher forms could begin. You see the little red circle, yes? Notice how the artist has shown some creatures crawling out of the water and onto land. Was that important? Of course, because we wouldn't be here if we didn't have terrestrial life. But notice how in this artist's rendition, which is not entirely accurate, that the earth is already vegetated. Now, have you thought about this? The animals come out of the water to eat things on land. There has to be stuff on land for them to eat. Where did that come from? The algae. The earth before the algae got out of the water, the earth after the algae got out of the water. The green algae literally conquered the land and gave rise to all of the land flora we enjoy today. That allowed terrestrial animals like us to, for better or worse, evolve and be here. So without the algae, no land plants. Without the land plants, no animals, no people. For better or for worse. Now, this may look like an ocean, strangely, but notice how it's labeled. It is a big lake. Is that important? Yes or no? Yes, I wouldn't have put that little label there if it weren't important, because it's an ocean picture, but it's supposed to be a lake. And the reason is that's where this historic event took place. 475 million years ago, according to some people, the green algae came out of the fresh water and conquered the land. And this cartoon by my colleague Jim Graham actually depicts one of the algae that might be the closest relative to the land plants today. How many of you have gone to sleep thinking about this important moment in history and time when the green algae conquered the land? I bet not one of you has gone to sleep thinking about this, and yet none of you would be here if it hadn't been for that historic moment in the evolution of the land flora. As indicated in the little footnote there, my colleagues in the world of science don't all agree about exactly when this occurred, whether it was 475 or 700 million years ago, but when it happened, it was important. Now, I'm not speaking tonight about any of my ultrastructure or molecular evolutionary research, but I will tell you that my special interest is the evolution of green algae and land plants. So this one slide is the only homage to my own research program. But you can see a very important feature here. First, all of the land plants are part of this big group called, in this case, the Viridiplantae, or the green plants. But most of the things in this big group are the green algae. The freshwater Charophyceae is the group that is known to have given rise to the land plants. They in turn are related to this little unicell of freshwater alga. And basically, as we'll see in this next slide, this story of evolution gives us the land flora, including massive trees, all coming from this little tiny freshwater alga. Fascinating area, worth a whole talk in itself. Now, for those of you who are the thinking types, why was it the freshwater green algae that gave rise to all the land plants and not the marine green algae? Think about that. Okay, so the algae gave rise to the land plants. With the land plants, we could have land animals. These are the plants and animals you know and love, and also love to eat. So basically, whether you're a vegetarian or not, all of the food you eat is here because green algae conquered the land. All of humankind is here because of that historic event that nobody goes to sleep thinking about. Now, we're going to talk about what the algae are. Are you ready? I'm going to keep this simple, all right? We've got red algae. We've got brown algae and green algae and golden algae, and I've already mentioned blue-green algae. And so it's pretty simple. There are different kinds of algae and they are colorful. It turns out, as many of you would realize, these colors are based on the actual photosynthetic and accessory pigments, the chemical pigments that are in these algae. And it turns out that those biochemical factors, like many others, do allow us to group all of these algae into major groups. So what is the definition for algae? Well, they are photoautotrophs, or photosynthesizing organisms, but we also include their colorless relatives, because there are some that have lost their pigments and their photosynthesis. The algae are all relatively morphologically simple, and their sexual structures and sex lives are, by our standards, pretty simple. Red, green, blue-green, yellow, gold, etc. is pretty simplistic. So for the more erudite, we have the appropriate scientific terms. The reds are the Rhodophyta, greens are the Chlorophyta, etc. And I've added some additional groups. So there are many interesting groups of algae with interesting names. Now, is everybody prepared? This next slide may be hard on you. Are you ready? Yes. You can handle this? Yes. Okay. All right. I'll leave this on for a little bit for those who are taking notes so you can get it all down. This is a relatively new tree of life based on current molecular evidence from my colleague Sandy Baldauf. There are many different versions of these kinds of trees. They are being refined as molecular data comes in to help us better understand the story. But now I'm going to show you the algae are all over the place. First, the seaweeds, marked by the asterisks, the browns, the greens, and the reds. Now, the other groups of algae, some of which I've already shown you by name on the screen. So all over this tree of life, there are these things called algae. The term for this is polyphyletic. That is to say, the algae are not a single, coherent, natural group, but rather represent all kinds of different organisms scattered about this tree of life. So polyphyletic. And I haven't even mentioned the cyanobacteria, because those are prokaryotes and are not even shown on this tree, which is just the eukaryotic or nucleus-containing forms of life. So the algae are scattered all over the tree of life. The algae are scattered all over the face of the earth. They are not really everywhere, but more or less. Most of you are quite aware that algae tend to live in the water, so that means they are in oceans and lakes and rivers and streams. Some of you ski enthusiasts know very well that the algae live in the snow and ice, and some of you may be aware that they can be in the air. They're also in the ground and rocks and on turtle backs. They grow on mosquito larvae antennae. Think about the scientists who figured that out. Why they were looking at mosquito larvae antennae to find these algae, I don't know. In hot springs, on ducks' feet, that was another interesting paper. The sulfur belly whale, why do you think the belly is yellow? It's because of algae growing on the belly, diatoms that give the color. Polar bears often turn green in zoos because of algae. The tropical sloths in the green foliage probably are saved from predation because they turn green, because green algae are growing on them. Even in little protozoans, there are lots of algae. And I'm not going to go into this so it's too close to dinner, but in humans, there are living algae in some cases. All right, so the algae more or less can occur almost anywhere. And now we'll get into some of the representatives. The plants are the green things, which I've already shown you. And so we'll start with the green seaweeds or green algae. There are very few characters I'm going to share with you because of the time limitations, so thank your lucky stars, you don't get the full lecture. But some characteristics that might be of interest. As I mentioned already, these are really plants. So if people say, are algae plants? The correct answer is yes, some algae are indeed plants. There may be around 8,000 species, different species of green algae. These numbers are very fluid and you can see different numbers in different places, so you don't take them too seriously. But 90% of the green algae tend to be fresh water, which is interesting, and that's where our land plants came from. And very quickly I'll just mention that The green algae range from tiny unicells that you can only see with a microscope to fairly large algae. Not giant like kelps, but large. Now, just a few quick examples. I've only chosen 2 or 3. The mermaid's cup, Acetabularia. Isn't it a beautiful name, Acetabularia? These little goblet-like algae, they are macroscopic. They're a couple of millimeters, so you can see them with a naked eye and handle them. Each of these goblets is a single cell, a large single cell. If that doesn't impress you, this is an adult human hand. This is the green alga Valonia, and that is a single cell. Okay? And if that doesn't impress you, I'm in trouble, because that is a pretty big cell. And these particular green algae have been very useful for various kinds of research approaches, cell physiology and cell biology. Now I want to briefly talk about the weeds. On the East Coast, codium is one, and in the Mediterranean, caulerpa is the bane. And many of you have heard or read about this scourge of the Mediterranean. It is a beautiful alga. Trust me. They look like feathers. And these can be maybe a foot tall. The whole plant can be maybe a few meters long. Everything you see is a single cell. And this gorgeous feather-like alga can grow like a weed, which is what it's doing, and spread throughout the Mediterranean. For those of you who have not heard the interesting story about this alga, it was released by accident from the aquarium in Monaco back in 1984. A marine biologist noticed the small population and sounded the alarm. Did people listen to him? Yes or no? No. And as you can see, the alga spread and spread further. And I believe there is no hope of actually eradicating it or controlling it in the Mediterranean. And heaven only knows how long it will take for natural systems to perhaps bring this alga under control. This is the Mediterranean, far from home. Lest you think some of these things are not important, this is a little headline, so to speak, from July 2006. Many of you may be more familiar with this story than I am, because I'm relatively new here. But in fact, we had caulerpa. It was introduced somehow, perhaps from a local home aquarium, and I believe millions of dollars were spent to eradicate it. And the eradication was a pretty wicked process in terms of releasing cyanide and other things to kill the alga. But apparently California avoided the problem that the Mediterranean suffered. Okay, now we're going to run to the second group of bigger algae, seaweeds, and that is the red algae. And I'm quickly going to show you that the red algae, according to the latest molecular data, belong very close to all the green things. So most scientists would now say that the red algae, which are very beautiful, are actually plants as well. So we have two groups of algae that are really plants. The rest are not, hence the quotation marks around plants. Now looking at the characteristics of the red algae, they are plants, maybe 6,000 to 8,000 species, and in this case 90% are marine, a flip sort of from what we saw with the green algae. Some of these red algae are actually calcified and are important components in coral reefs. Nancy Knowlton is not here, so I can perhaps get away with saying this. Red algae experts don't even use the term coral reef, because that ignores how important the coral and red algae can be. They refer to them as biological reefs. And that way the full credit to the coral and algae is at least possible. Many of you are familiar with agar and the carrageenans. These are commercial polysaccharide products that come from the red algae and have been used in an industrial economic sense for at least 200 or 300 years. Many of you are more familiar with porphyra. This is what it looks like on a herbarium sheet, and that is lava or the coating around your sushi. So when you are eating sushi, you are eating algae. And if you like sushi, remember that. If you don't like sushi, forget it. Pharmaceuticals, which I'll talk about again in a second, are an important topic relative to the algae. And red algae have been used in experimental processes for many years looking for antivirus and anti-cancer compounds. And lastly, I'm just going to mention porphyridium. Porphyridium is a unicell, shown in this transmission electron microscope picture. And because it was a single cell, red alga, it was used in a lot of fundamental research, comparing, for example, photosynthesis in red algae with photosynthesis in green plants. Also, I worked on that organism for my PhD. Finishing the seaweeds, we're going to jump over here to the brown algae. These are the macho algae. And that is because they generally are very big. Now, it's interesting, on that tree of life, it's quite clear they are not closely related to the plants. So they are not plants in a strict sense. However, it is fascinating. The giant kelps have evolved anatomy that is, in a sense, identical to that in land plants, including trees. So they're very plant-like, even if they're not plants. Only 2,200 species, and almost all of them are marine. Anybody who finds freshwater brown algae is almost instantly famous because they're so rare. There are some small brown algae, including the rare freshwater one, but most of them are large, macroscopic things. You see the seaweeds along the shore, and of course the giant kelps. Alginic acid is the compound in the walls of many of the kelps, including Macrocystis, that has been the basis of industrial use for a long, long time. The whole industry was a nice story for San Diego, and as soon as I moved here, Kelco, I believe, closed down its kelp processing operations and has gone to Scotland. But nevertheless, the whole story of the ecology of the kelp beds and the industry is a fascinating topic and a whole separate lecture. This is just a rogues gallery because many of you are familiar with these brown seaweeds along the shores. Various species of fucus are found almost everywhere. These little receptacles filled with a jelly-like substance. Some children like to squeeze and pop them. At least on the East Coast, some people like to eat them, almost like salty jelly beans. For those of you who do either thing, I will let you know that these are basically the sexual reproductive structure holding parts of the plant, so you are eating all the sex organs of the alga, so to speak. But if that doesn't bother you, then fine. Postelsia, most people on the West Coast are clearly familiar with at least seeing this magnificent organism, the ecology of which is fascinating given the habitat in which it grows. Finally, Macrocystis, the kelp forest alga, no need to say much there. Sargassum, the alga that myth and stories are based on, occurring in masses in the open ocean, as you see in the map above and the picture below. So these are some of the sort of macho brown algae. And now we're going to jump as we wind down to the small things. I'm going to start with the blue-green algae. They are cyanobacteria or prokaryotes. They do not have a nucleus. They are generally small, although some of them make big colonies you can pick up in your bare hands. Many of you may have heard of the term stromatolite. These are the structures formed by the blue-green algae in certain environments. In Mexico and in Australia today, they still exist and are being formed. Some of the stromatolites date back to 3.5 billion years ago. Part of the proof we have that those blue-greens were there making oxygen. I have labeled this specialized cell the heterocyst. Is this important? Oh yes, because it's labeled and it's got a red arrow, it's got to be important. Now why? Anybody? It is the site of? Right, nitrogen fixation. And is that important? Yes, it is very important. Some people have said that next to photosynthesis and respiration, nitrogen fixation is the third most important sort of biochemical process on the face of the planet. So these specialized little cells are specialized for nitrogen fixation. Fascinating story in terms of the ultrastructure and biochemistry. If you don't think this is important, check with me later on how many tens of millions of dollars Dow Chemical and others have spent trying to unlock the mysteries of biological nitrogen fixation because it's such an important process. Now, continuing with our theme of little things, we're down to the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton are the pasturage of the seas. And you know, I've already alluded to the fact that the green algae gave rise to the land plants, and the land plants are what land animals eat. So whether you're a vegetarian or not, everything you eat comes from, ultimately, the algae in a sense. In the oceans, for those of you who like seafood, please remember that it is the algae that are the pasturage of the sea. It is the algae that are the photosynthesizers, that are producing the initial food that supports all of life in the oceans. So if you like fish, the ones that we are allowed to eat now, any form of seafood, then the algae are the starting point. So there are three major groups of phytoplankton that are the bulk of this pasturage of the sea: the dinoflagellates, the diatoms, and the Coccolithophores. So we will quickly go through all of these, showing you the tree of life again to show you that these groups are not closely related. They are spread out on that tree of life, but they are unified in terms of those features, being photosynthetic, being relatively simple, and having relatively simple reproduction. Now, the dinoflagellates, or Pyrophyta, beautiful classical name for them. Most of you, if you know about them because of the red tides, or the HABs, that is, harmful algal blooms. Serration, beautiful dinoflagellate, but the next picture shows you a bloom of Noctiluca. This is a little boat with a human being, normal-sized human being, I believe, and so it gives you a feeling for the extent of this bloom of the dinoflagellate Noctiluca. Well, many of you are familiar with paralytic shellfish poisoning, diuretic shellfish poisoning, neurotoxic shellfish poisoning, etc. And the dinoflagellates are involved with most of those harmful conditions and the toxins associated with them. And it is true that there seem to be more harmful algal blooms around the world than there have been in the past. And where they do occur, they very often are more extensive than they had been before. Now, some of you may think that this is an example of why algae are bad. But of course, that is not really the case. The algae are not bad. They're there, they're doing their thing, but in many cases, the reason they bloom in such dangerous quantities is because the nutrient levels have been increased way beyond normal. And who do you think did that? People. Got that? So remember, algae good, people bad. If you stick with that mantra, most of the time, you'll be right. The reason some of these harmful algal blooms are occurring in different locations is because the dinoflagellates have been transported from one part of the world to another where they shouldn't be, and they take off and bloom. Who do you think transported them? People, in ballast water, for example. And so, of course, these algae in a new fertile environment go wild. And so, again, the algae are really not the problem. It is the people who are the problem. If you don't believe me, eliminate all the people, and I can assure you there'll be no more bad headlines about all these environmental problems. Now, the diatoms. The diatoms are worth several lectures just by themselves. For one reason, they're very abundant and perhaps one of the most important groups of phytoplankton in terms of production, but they live in glass houses. And think about that. They make their own glass houses. These diagrams show you different views and illustrate that the walls or frustules, or epitheca and hypotheca, are built more or less like a petri plate. This presents some problems in terms of your cytoplasm living inside a glass house. Now, there's not time to go into a lot of interesting stuff about diatoms. However, some of you know that in the Victorian days, people used to make diatom pictures, moving the little diatoms around and gluing them down and so forth. You see before you a contemporary diatom art piece by Klaus Kemp in the United Kingdom. These are all diatoms that he has maneuvered into position and fixed in position to create beautiful things. The colors you see are from the refraction. Basically, those diatoms are colorless glass, but it's the ornamentation that refracts the light to give you the various colors that you're seeing. And we just have, I think, two more. This is my favorite. I think as a botanist, and those are all diatoms. For those of you who are not botanical, here's one that's kind of cute. And I have to tell you, he has done the Scripps logo in diatoms. I didn't get that in time to show you tonight, and I wasn't certain whether I wanted to show you an unacceptable logo tonight, because we want to be careful about logos, but he has done the Scripps logo. Now, the diatom art is straying a little bit because that really doesn't underscore the importance, although the aesthetic importance, I guess, can be mentioned. So I just wanted to mention that some of my colleagues here at Scripps have an interest in diatoms that is more scientific. And as you see from this slide, Dr. Mark Hildebrand and many colleagues actually around the world are studying diatoms because of their potential in terms of micro or nano devices. And if you think about that, these diatoms have these beautiful glass structures, which you just saw in those beautiful pictures. Each of these is different. Each of these is faithfully reproduced by that particular species. Tremendous detail, very microscopic. How do the cells do it? And so there's a lot of work going on to try and either learn how they do it or use them to create other structures. Similarly, Brian Palaniuk in Hubbs Hall here at Scripps is one of those scientists who's also interested in basic biology, and in this case using diatoms as well as cyanobacteria to look at the photosynthetic processes and the responses of these organisms to their environment. We're going to wind down here with the Coccolithophorids. That's the hard one to pronounce towards the end of the evening here. Coccolithophorids, or haptophytes. And these are unbelievable organisms. This is a tiny one over here. That's a very good picture with a very good microscope, light microscope. So it's a very tiny cell. This drawing is easier to see, and the little structures, those are the coccoliths. Little calcium carbonate, circular stone-like scales on the surface of the cell. So the cells are called Coccolithophorids, the things that carry coccoliths. I did a lot of electron microscopy, so I want to show you these little coccoliths enlarged in the scanning electron microscope. It's still very tiny, but look how beautiful, look how ornate. All of these coccoliths cover the surface of the cell. But remember, this cell is invisible to the naked eye, just visible with a light microscope. These coccoliths generally are just barely visible in a very fine microscope. So are coccoliths big? Yes or no? No. Are they small? Yes. Are they very small? Yes. Are they really, really tiny? Yes. Is that important? Yes. And this is why. Those of you who've seen the White Cliffs of Dover, are those cliffs small? No, those are big white cliffs. And what are they made of? Chalk. And what is the chalk? Calcium carbonate, coccoliths from the Coccolithophorids. Do you know how many Coccolithophorids it takes to make the White Cliffs of Dover? All right, do you understand? I mean, this is totally unbelievable that for millions and millions of years, the productivity was so great in the oceans that the accumulation of these tiny calcium carbonate particles could amass like that. Now, just to be sure the coverage is complete, there is a group of tiny plankton called the pico or phytoplankton. These plankton are so small the scientists couldn't find them and didn't know they existed. However, they're actually one of the most important components in terms of overall production in the ocean. You may be wondering, if they're so small we don't know they exist, how do we know they exist now? And that's a separate story. But it helps emphasize lots of these tiny phytoplankton organisms in the oceans for billions of years, photosynthesizing, producing various things. You leave them doing their thing for billions of years, and what do you get? Well, you get the white cliffs of Dover I showed you. What else do you get? I'll give you a hint. Gas and oil, ladies and gentlemen. I come from Louisiana, and we know all about this. And even after Katrina, the coasts of the Gulf of Mexico, we have over 4,000 gas and oil platforms out there. These deposits are almost all based from algal deposits going back to the Cretaceous. So because of the algae, you have gas and oil as a relatively cheap, except recently, source of energy for human progress. And so here in California, you've got progress. Now, there are some of you who care for the environment might think that there are some problems with gas and oil and pollution and cars and so forth. May I remind you that the algae provided the gas and oil. It was not the algae that led to this kind of use of that resource. So once again, the algae are good, the people are bad. Now, many of you are much more practical than an ivory tower scientist, and so you're thinking in terms of patents and industry and money and so forth, and well, algae people like to think that way occasionally too. This is a recent article, July 2006, where a Spanish firm claims it can make oil from the plankton. I just gave you a brief piece of that article to raise the issue. So basically they're saying we can grow the algae goes to gas, usable gas or biofuel, and then we have more progress. Now, some of you are kind of jaded, and the first thing you might say is, you know, this article comes from Spain, and that's a foreign country far away, and I don't believe it. Well, I have to tell you, I'm a little skeptical about this particular claim, but I want to bring home some reality here. This is an aerial view of General Atomics San Diego facility. You all see that? Guess what they came to Scripps to talk to Bill Gerwick and me and maybe some others about. Algae as a source of biofuel. So it's not just in Spain, around the world, this is actually a viable idea. I believe Ralph Lewin even proposed something along these lines 15 years ago. The first alga that I collected from a cow pond in New Hampshire in the 1960s, Botryococcus brownii, his poetic name. The oils that green alga makes can be fed into a refinery directly to make fuel. So it's not quite so far-fetched. Finally, the last phase here, most of you are familiar with the very exciting things going on at Scripps in terms of the Center for Marine Biotechnology and Biomedicine. Bill Fennicle has helped to make Scripps the leading site in the world for this kind of important and innovative research. Many of you, like my wife Melanie and I, had the pleasure last month to hear my colleague Bill Gerwick give a fascinating lecture specifically on pond scum, blue-green algae as a source of many interesting biochemical compounds, potentially medically useful, and sources of biochemical pathways that are important for us and for our future. So, I haven't covered everything, but I think time is running out, and I'm going to give you the big picture once again. The Big Bang was maybe 14 to 16 billion years ago. They've been pushing it back to 16 billion. It took a while, but somewhere in there around 3.5 billion years ago, I started my story with the blue-green algae. So basically, what I've tried to tell you tonight, and I don't know how easy you are to convince, but I've pointed out The algae are a source of more than half the oxygen we're breathing, but they were the source of the oxygen that changed the evolutionary history of the planet. I've told you that the pasturage of the sea are algae, and they are the source basically of all seafood that we consume and abuse in terms of over-consuming in many parts of the world now. I've also pointed out that the land plants are the descendants of the green algae, which means that all of the land food, the steak and broccoli and the potatoes, are here because of the algae. So the algae have given you the oxygen you breathe and all the food you eat. But they've also given you the oil and gas that keeps your cars going and our industries going, etc., for better or for worse. And now there's even a hint that the algae might produce a new source of gas and oil for future as our supplies of the original old gas and oil are depleted. And finally, there is no question that the algae are among those marine organisms that are providing new pharmaceutical compounds that are extremely important, especially as we see disease organisms becoming, in a sense, immune to the antibiotics that we currently have. So given all of that, I would hope that you agree that the algae are the world's most important plants. And you don't have to jump up and scream, I believe, although I was going to try and get some of my friends to do that. But with that, this is indeed the last slide, and thank you very much. The question is, why was the caulerpa in the lagoon a problem that required more than $1 million worth of eradication, right? Basically. And the answer is that it can grow like a weed. And what it will do is take over and, first of all, eliminate other plants and animals that are native to that area. It also then becomes an actual physical nuisance for swimming and recreation. And so that's, in a sense, the main reason. And the other thing is that, as they learned in the Mediterranean, even if in that lagoon it would not be an unbearable problem, if it had not been eradicated, it would soon have spread further and further to other areas. Cover it? And by the way, I mentioned that those beautiful feather-like algal plants, the caulerpas, are single cells, which is, I mean, that's almost mind-boggling to think about that. So let's say one of you is an eager beaver, and now we get some caulerpa in the children's pool to create even more havoc there. And you go, trying to at least eliminate that problem, you go and you tear up that caulerpa, okay, and rip it out. Now, you think you are doing a good job, but what happens is you break those beautiful feathers, and some of that cytoplasm oozes out. And does it just say, I'm defeated, I'm dead? No. That cytoplasm balls up, reforms, and grows into a whole new plant. So you rip out one 3-foot piece of caulerpa, and you get 24 little globs of protoplasm in the water, and next month they're going to be 24 big feathery plants again. So it's a fascinating organism. The question is, the acidification of the ocean has been mentioned, and then I believe the way this question was worded was, could the algae, in a sense, have a beneficial effect in terms of this problem?
Yes, isn't it so that the algae take the carbon and make it into oxygen?
So the comment with the question is that the algae are pulling carbon dioxide out of the water, so could they be a part of helping the situation as we see acidification? Well, that's an interesting perspective, and my first answer would be no. Yes, they are pulling the carbon dioxide out. They're doing that all the time, but the acidification of the water will adversely affect those algae like the Coccolithophores and like the coral and red algae that right now are creating these hard substances at a lower pH. And there's a question of how they will survive as the pH actually rises. And the algae are not preventing that rise, even though they are pulling CO2 out. The question was, I guess, do I have any rough estimate of the volume of algae it would take to generate a certain amount of fuel? In other words, to replace, say, the U.S. consumption of gas and oil. And the answer is no. I certainly don't. However, that is one of the practical questions or problems in terms of all of these potential commercial plans to use algae as a source of biofuels. And the other thing, of course, is that you have to have sunlight for the photosynthesis to begin with, and so you're limited to an outdoor situation if you don't want to spend money on electricity. So now you're outdoors, you're trying to grow algae in great quantities, although I can't give you the estimate of what the volume would be, but they're growing outdoors where there are other things in the air. And so how do you grow a pure culture of an oil-producing alga if you're growing it in mammoth tanks out of doors? So there are a lot of practical questions, not the least of which is the volume, the total volume. The question is, do they know what the byproducts would be from the combustion of these potential algal fuels as compared to, say, the current combustion of regular gas or diesel? And my answer was, at least for the Batriococcus example that I gave, my understanding is that it would be a very analogous situation to regular gasoline. I mean, it would be fed into the same refineries and the product would be similar enough to gasoline. There would not be a significant difference one way or the other. However, I do not know what these current articles, like the one I showed from Spain, or what the people at General Atomics are working on, I do not know exactly what their target fuel is, so I can't say about that. The question was, it's actually the Coccolithophores, why did they build the White Cliffs of Dover? Well, you know, if they were people, I'd say it's because they had some relatives who were going to sell postcards to the White Cliffs of Dover in the background. But basically, the Coccolithophores were just blooming in the oceans. And then when the individual cells died, those coccoliths are basically permanent, and they just sank. And so they were just sinking for millions or billions of years. The algae didn't know that they were going to create such a scenic coast for England. They were just happy to be in the oceans doing their thing. And so it was just the passive accumulation forming these massive layers, which then concreted with time and pressure, and then geological forces pushed them up. And so then but they were at the bottom of the sea originally. I might mention that global warming is certainly a current topic, and I didn't get into that at all. However, I believe this is reasonably accurate. Some of these blooms of the Coccolithophores turn the ocean basically white, pale gray. And it is believed that actually that helps reflect sunlight, and that these blooms are part of the whole picture of the heat balance of the planet, so that they are doing good. There are other ways in which the algae are also supposed to be helping to mitigate against global warming. Well, I think with my colleague Bill Gerwick here, and I can defer to him, the question is, in terms of the pharmaceuticals, are things advancing or not? And the answer is that I think Bill Gerwick, and perhaps I would say, we're not sure they're advancing as fast as we would like in terms of the tremendous potential. But that has to do with getting the agencies and the funding sources to provide the further development of these important compounds. And so I think that, yes, it's advancing. We do have more exciting new compounds that have potential, but they're not being taken into potential medicines as fast as they could or should be. The question is that locally, offshore, some people swimming can encounter a white, almost soapy-like substance that is said to be an algal byproduct. And the question is, do I know anything about that? Well, the answer is no in terms of here and what you're seeing. However, yes, in terms of there are algae that do that and produce an almost scummy-like white substance that very often will wash up on beaches. But I have to admit I'm not familiar with that out here, so I would be interested to know exactly what it is here. Yeah?
Thank you very, very much.